Let me, before I begin, introduce the term superiorism, on which I will refer today a lot. I suggest that understanding the term superiorism like this, it should be understood as a pathological incapability and or an unwillingness to accept otherness sui generis, an incapability and or an unwillingness to take the other as the other seriously. And since in this study the other is the female human being, and since the othering one is the male human being, we address the superiorism discussed here as andro-superiority. The strange phenomenon of andro-superiority of male philosophers asserting the superiority of male philosophers can be found throughout the historical canon of Western philosophy, at least for 2,600 years, if we take Hesiod as one of the first testimonies. It must be admitted, of course, that misogyny is a historical fact, and yet, as it seems to me, there has not been a single legitimate philosophical argument provided as to why any human being should consider the assertion that male human beings are superior to be true. So I would like to suggest here that the process that leads to the position of anti-female superiorism can be described as the cycle of superiorism. The cycle of superiorism allows a description of how superiorism and the specific case of andro-superiorism has become a self-reinforcing pseudo-reality. So the cycle of superiorism begins with the observation of a difference. Something is observed, a difference is observed between the observer and something else, another observer, or two observed entities. The observation might be one of an actual or of just an alleged difference. Here it's only of importance that our observing philosopher assumes that his finding is a factual observation of reality. And from here, we move on to the difference observed suddenly shifting. The difference observed shows some human beings being like this and some other human beings being like that. But at the same time, however, these observations are also observations about some human beings being like this and thus being superior, and some human beings being like that and thus being inferior. And the difference between the one and the other human being is presented to the philosophical audience as a factum brutum, a self-evident reality that needs no further explanation. We can think of Aristotle when he writes, the male, quote, is by nature better fitted to command than the female, sorry. Observing philosopher does not claim to have arbitrarily posited the one human being as superior. The human being's superiority and the other human being's inferiority are presented as self-evident. So the philosopher is observing, Aristotle is seeing a normative ontological difference of humanity. And he assumes that we, his audience, will now see this difference as well. We're quasi-necessitated into accepting the factual reality of superior and inferior human beings, of superhumans and subhumans. And suddenly the superhuman is no longer an excess of an andro-superiorist fantasy, but it just turned into a matter of fact. And it is important to emphasize again that we have never been provided with a philosophical explanation for this normative interpretation. So how is this anti-philosophical jump from two different entities to two entities of different values possible? And I would guess the answer is rather obvious. We're facing a fallacy, namely the superhuman fallacy. The superhuman fallacy happens precisely in the moment when a philosopher introduces a normative difference between human beings, precisely in the moment when the one human being becomes the sole normative point of reference for the other human being. The superhuman fallacy happens when a human being arbitrarily superhumanizes themselves and equally arbitrarily subhumanizes all those who are not enough like themselves. So the superhuman fallacy is a fallacy because it arbitrarily connects the phenomenon of beings being different to these beings being of different value. So let us repeat. The observed difference metamorphoses from an observation of something being like this and something else being like that into a normative statement about something being like this and thus being superior, and about something being like this, that, and thus being inferior. The philosophical observer is narcissistically echoing the initial normative interpretation. A philosophical justification for all this is nowhere in sight. And from this, the cycle moves on to the deduction of entitlement of domination. So from the putative empirical truth of superiority, our observer infers a practical entitlement of superiority. And that means in practical terms, nothing but domination and suppression. Finding oneself superior means in practical terms finding oneself entitled, even necessitated, to dominate the inferior other. And often enough, the superior one seems to be unable to leave the inferior one alone. The inferior one seems to urge the superior one to react to the outrageousness of the fact of their respective inferiority, which we can very often observe when we see that certain philosophers will not let go of philosophically harassing their female colleagues. This alleged necessity to dominate can be practiced in many different ways, and of course it can be used against many different allegedly inferior others, not only against female human beings. Most other traits of the dominated other are devalued or even completely lost in the process of the superiorist domination. Only the superiorist himself can, according to his self-understanding, because the superiorist is not like the inferior other, develop a vital and rich personhood. And from here, we move to the fourth stage, the practice and reinforcement. And every practice of domination, be it one of brutal violence or one of tacit microaggression, such as domination through enforced ignorance or gaslighting, will reinforce the understanding of the superior one as the superior one and the inferior one as the inferior one. And we can now determine superiorism from a new perspective. Superiorism is the conviction of one's own superiority as an observable factual reality that entitles, without any further moral doubt, to dominate and to suppress those who are not like oneself. The created others are not embraced by the moral standards of the non-others. The others can be treated, apparently without producing a contradiction, using divergent moral rules. Superiorism is an inability or an unwillingness to accept the other, to incorporate the other into reality, to take the other seriously based on the superhuman or superiorist fallacy. The inferiority of female human beings is only evident because the cycle of superiorism created a reality in which the inferiority can be pseudo-observed as if it were self-evident. We must thus conclude that the andro-superiorist philosophy does not exist because male human beings are factually superior, to nobody's surprise. Something being a historical fact only indicates that this something was a possible reality and became a factual reality. And this by no means implies that the possible reality necessarily had to become a factual reality. There is no reason to believe that human beings were necessitated into making andro-superiority a factual reality. Andro-superiority is not inevitable. It is not our necessitated destiny. It is not the status naturalis of the human being. Even though many philosophers have attempted to tell the story of philosophy like this, the exact opposite is the case. Andro-superiority exists only because it is possible, because certain human beings made this possible reality a factual reality through their will and their actions, and because certain human beings continue to do so whether they are conscious of this or not. The factual reality of andro-superiority is a phenomenon not necessarily connected with philosophy and not necessarily connected with the nature of the human being. Female human beings were violently excluded from the human endeavor of philosophy because of nothing other than the will and the actions of certain philosophers, because of nothing other than certain philosophers violently willing them out of the human endeavor of philosophy. And whatever has motivated the hearts and minds of those anti-female philosophers, their wills and actions were never motivated by philosophical arguments. Still, their thoughts, of course, had an impact, a massive impact even on philosophers and philosophy itself. The rhetoric of Western philosophy, intentionally or not, produces an understanding that this philosophy is inviting and addressing all human beings. However, this is, for many philosophers, simply not the case. We need to find out why the misogynists of Western philosophy, of the Western historical canon, speak outside of their explicit misogynist remarks, overall in an inclusive language. Despite their claims, Aristotle, Augustine, Thomas, Hume, Rousseau do not speak to all human beings. They only speak as a philosophical elite to a philosophical elite. They speak only to those who are sufficiently like themselves, and that means to only those who do not lack maleness. Certainly, it would be a gross exaggeration to suggest that all the key texts of Western philosophy are misogynistic. However, from the early days of Western philosophy until today, misogyny is so present that it can be identified as one of its defining conditions and one of its driving forces. And the disturbing driving force of misogyny has rarely, if at all, been criticized amongst those who became canonical in Western philosophy. Anti-philosophical, anti-female andro-superiorist violence has rarely, if at all, been acknowledged as a problem, and often not even as a relevant phenomenon that could affect the philosophical quality of a philosophical approach. Of course, always with the exception of the critique brought forth by female and or feminist philosophers. But for example, the Aristotelian ideas of friendship or the Kantian ideas of peace have rarely been questioned regarding their radical, arbitrary, exclusionist, and violent andro-superiority. Again, of course, with the exception of the critique by female and or feminist philosophers. Andro-superiorist violence is often still understood to be a problem only for this one specific branch of philosophy, which would be feminist philosophy. It is not understood as a problem for all philosophers, but only for those who have developed a special sensitivity in quotation marks, to such problems, and that is the female philosophers. The absurdity of that brazen shift of the problem is obvious. It is up to those who suffer from the violence to find a way to come to peace with this, and this audacity has shifted the burden of proof. The problem of andro-superiorist violence is suddenly a problem for female human beings and a natural fact for male human beings. It is a problem for those who are unable and or unwilling to simply accept reality as it is. It is a mere natural fact for those who are able and or willing to accept reality as it is. And those capable human beings could ask, who would make someone responsible for a natural fact? The continued existence of andro-superiority, the exclusion of female philosophers, was never about philosophy. It was never about female human beings being philosophers. It was always about those human beings not being male. There's simply no justification for the wholesale exclusion of women philosophers from our discipline. This practice of inclusion has yet to come to an end. It is still a factual reality, as you all know. If we still find the exclusion of female human beings in philosophy, then this is due to the fact that some philosophers are simply either continue to refuse to give up their conviction of andro-superiority, or that the conviction of andro-superiority is not understood as a conviction, but as a reality. The exclusion of female philosophers is philosophically unjustifiable. It is anti-philosophical, anti-exclusionary practice, and it is detrimental to the philosophy in itself. I'm so sorry. I'm just realizing that I'm so carefully moving on in my slides, but I forgot to share them with you. I'm very sorry for that. One defense of andro-superiority often comes in the form of the myth of the zeitgeist. The myth of the zeitgeist goes something like this. Andro-superiority is unsurprising to be expected in, it is unsurprising to find andro-superiority. It is to be expected in the thought and the philosophical self-understanding of a particular time. Philosophers cannot be held as responsible since they were just children of their time. However, if zeitgeist renders certain philosophers unable to think in a non-andro-superiorist way, how would it change into a non-andro-superiorist direction ever be possible? And how would the zeitgeist not continuously prevent this change? This does not seem to be the case. And if it is indeed not the case, it would certainly be reasonable to criticize the andro-superiorist philosophers, because these philosophers are either unable to do so for personal reasons, or they simply didn't want to do so for personal reasons. It could be admitted that the zeitgeist might make it difficult to see an injustice, but it is hardly an excuse. The zeitgeist does not necessitate andro-superiorist thinking. We need to continue to think about another question. Let us assume that the zeitgeist does in fact mandate andro-superiority. How would it then be possible to find a significant number of sources calling to overcome this superiority? First of all, it is fairly obvious that those who suffered the andro-superiorist violence certainly knew, despite any boundaries of the zeitgeist, that they were inferiorized. Christine de Pizan, Sor Juana Inés de la Cruz, Mary Estelle, Catherine Trotter Cockburn, Mary Wollstonecraft, Emilie du Châtelet, Sojourner Truth, or Harriet Taylor Mill understood andro-superiority as violent injustice, and they made that abundantly clear in their works. And the zeitgeist myth will become even more brittle if it were possible to show that not only female philosophers knew about its inherent anti-human violence, but also male philosophers. And we can find those. Think just of Theodor von Hippel, mayor of Königsberg, friend and student of the avid misogynist Immanuel Kant, and a central claim in his book über die bürgerliche Verbesserung der Weiber was that excluding women from the public sphere is a travesty of justice that prevents the advancements of humanity towards genuine civilization. Taking von Hippel's ideas into account, the misogyny of Immanuel Kant can no longer be protected by the idea of the zeitgeist. And finally, again, using Kant as example, the myth of the zeitgeist underestimates the philosophical capabilities of the canonical philosophers in the strangest way. Kant expressly understood his philosophy as a revolution, as a turning point. It was widespread until Kant's transcendental philosophy was developed to assume that objects determined their perception and not the other way around. We thus have to question whether it is truly too much to ask of a philosopher such as Kant, who was able to revolutionize the epistemological principles of the Western philosophy, to understand that he succumbed to an utterly baseless andro-superiorist. So what is to be done? And my suggestion would be, or one idea would be, to de-superiorize. So we've understood superiorism as an incapability, an unwillingness to accept otherness sui generis, and as an incapability and or an unwillingness to take the other seriously. De-superiorization is accordingly to be understood as the philosophical practice that allows us, at times even necessitates us, to develop the capability and willingness to accept otherness sui generis, to become capable, able, willing to take the other as the other seriously. So de-superiorization is consciously, intentionally, and practically to unwant one's own alleged superiority. And I would like to conclude my contribution with a rather abstract idea of what that is. To de-superiorize a philosophical thought in the context of this study means practically, first of all, to investigate whether a thought, an idea, or a philosophy commits the superhuman fallacy. So we need to find out whether a philosophical thought, for example, the Aristotelian idea of friendship, or Augustine's idea of free will, Descartes' idea of science, or Habermas' idea of society, in whatever form, implies that there's a normatively relevant difference between human beings. In the case of this study, between male and female human beings. And should this be the case, then we have good reason to believe that we've found a superiorist thought. And now we need to investigate whether this thought necessarily depends on the superhuman fallacy. We need to find out whether the thought in question can only be thought when the superhuman fallacy is committed, or whether it is possible to replace the ideas of superhumanity and subhumanity with the idea of humanity, humanity in a most serious and sincere sense. And subsequently, we need to investigate what happens to the thought when humanity replaces the idea of superhumanity and subhumanity. So we would need to figure out what sense a thought makes after we have removed the fallacy. Is there anything left of the initial thought, or is it substantially superior? Do we have to give up this thought because it vanished with the removal of the superhuman fallacy, or can we continue a tradition of this thought after its de-superiorization? So it is important to note that de-superiorization does not aim merely for the destruction of the Western philosophical canon, but only to neutralize its superiorisms. And it is yet to be determined what will be left of philosophy as we know it today. We cannot know this now. We, and this we includes anyone who feels addressed, do, however, know that we cannot ever make the claim to philosophize properly, should we lack the courage to face the bitter reality that our Western philosophical heritage, as we find it today, might be rooted in superiorism such as the andro-superiorist. We might find that we might be able to save all philosophical thought. We might find that we hardly need to de-superiorize anything, even though I would be very surprised by that. But as long as we have not philosophically investigated and de-superiorized our superiorist philosophical traditions, we cannot know whether the superiorisms still affect us or not. And thus we cannot know whether we continue to commit acts of violence or not. And who would dare to live with this uncertainty? So philosophy as we find it today is to a significant degree the result of violence. We find ideas to be relevant not primarily or solely because they are philosophically sound. The will and execution of violence significantly contributed to making them relevant, while silencing any philosophical challenges to these very ideas. Western philosophy, as we find it today, is not the result of all human beings philosophizing together, but rather of a self-aggrandized elite violently dominating the human endeavor of philosophy. And those who suffered from this violence have understood what is to be done. Not enough of those who have committed the violence, though, and continue to commit this violence, have understood their part. Well, I would guess that there are no more excuses. We, and again, this we includes anyone who feels addressed, need to de-superiorize ourselves and make philosophy finally an endeavor of all humankind. Thank you very much.